Welcome to Fight News Now Extra. I'm John Pollock alongside John Ramdeen. Many topics to discuss. First of all, there was a big news item over the past weekend that didn't get a whole lot of attention by people.
I thought it was fake, that's why.
Well, I'm talking about Brent Brookhouse and John S. Nash at BloodyElbow.com breaking what could be the biggest story of 2015, and that is a number of unnamed fighters banding together and preparing to launch a class action lawsuit against the UFC, which could be in the 9-figure range. No names are attached to this. It's very vague right now, and the class action lawsuit has not yet been filed. But John, I mean, you've spoken to enough fighters and you hear stories all over the place, and it seems that now there is at least some sense of organization here about these fighters essentially standing up for what they feel they're being owed.
What's funny is I've heard about this for a number of years. Fighters have come up to me and they've talked to, they're just having a discussion about, what has happened about mixed martial arts, because right now there's no playbook. It has such a short history, so we're just trying to figure out things as we go. And a number of these fighters feel that they've been wronged in the past, and they feel that now that they've helped, grow the UFC, that it's their time, that they deserve a piece of the action, especially considering all the injuries that they've sustained. So, but again, this is something they're talking in your ear. You never know if it'll come to fruition. And when I saw it this weekend, it's like, okay, this is the time. Maybe this is real. This is something that, is going to affect the landscape of mixed martial arts moving forward.
I think the Reebok deal is really going to be a game changer for a lot of these fighters. And one that comes to mind, especially in light of all the incidents over the past week, was Nate Diaz. And you're in this position where you're saying, does the UFC just cut bait with this guy? It's clearly, he's sending a message almost that he doesn't want to be here. And if you're Nate Diaz, I mean, after that performance against Dos Anjos, he might be out of the top 15. So he's in that bottom tier of what you'd be making. If you are a fighter that you're somewhat on the downside of your career, but you have a name attached with you, Bellator is the organization for you, where you can go out, you can get all the sponsors you want, you can fight on free television. It's a very attractive offer to a lot of fighters. Quinton Jackson, another one, who he's not going to be your number 1, number 2 ranked light heavyweight in the UFC. And
that's irrelevant, yeah.
It hurts his sponsorship dollars. And over in Bellator, that's a huge, attractive promotion now for fighters that are looking to make as much as they can in the sponsorship game and not be restricted.
That's true, but it just comes down to what the UFC wants to do. Nathan Diaz is under contract, and if the UFC wants, they can allow this contract to expire. They can make Nathan Diaz fight every single one of these fights, and they can really screw him in the grand scheme of things. And I think it's Nathan Diaz's fault because of the way he's handled the entire situation. Instead of going to the UFC and dealing with it the way you should deal with it, he's gone about and did things the way that he's used to dealing with things.
Let's rewind to this past weekend, because lost in all of the UFC cards was a World Series of Fighting event, which was really something to watch as the Fox card's happening, and you're following things on Twitter and no one is talking about this show. It just seems like it was a real misfire going head to head with the UFC. But nonetheless,
the timing worked out well. The UFC finishes, we flip over to TSN.
You had the 2 title fights.
And what happened? We get to see 2 title fights. Worked out perfectly for me.
Rousimar Palhares and Jon Fitch. Palhares locks on a knee bar, and upon viewing it, I didn't sense anything of an issue. And afterwards, of course, I think because it's Rousimar Palhares, he's under a microscope for this. And you watch it back, it was probably a second longer than you'd like. But I think that he also does receive a lot of criticism because of who he is. That said, a knee bar, 1 second of difference could be the difference between tearing your ACL or not.
That's very true, but I think all you have to do is talk to Jon Fitch. Is Jon Fitch satisfied with what happened? And it seems that he was. There was no complaints by Jon Fitch. It was one of those situations.
I think this debate will come out any time that Rousimar Palhares wins in that fashion.
And Boss Rutten mentioned it. He said, this guy isn't really known as a dirty guy. It seems that once he gets inside the cage, he has this mentality, a mentality of fear and one of self-preservation. And I'm sure as human beings, we can all understand that it's a very, very stressful environment. But the opposite side of that is, well, then don't do it. If you can't handle being inside of the cage and you're going to hurt somebody after the bell rings or after the referee steps in, you have no business being in there. But this situation seems to be okay with Jon Fitch.
Lance Palmer is the new World Series of Fighting featherweight champion, and we know the wrestling of Lance Palmer. We got to see his striking of where that's evolved to now under Dwayne Ludwig and Martin Kampmann.
And you talked about that, not a lot of people are talking about the World Series of Fighting and specifically this event. we're talking about an event, the 145-pound championship that had the Team Alpha Male wrestling coach who's been working under Dwayne Ludwig. You've seen how fast, how explosive. Chad Mendez was in his corner. Uriah Faber was there. Martin Kampman was there. Lance Palmer's speed is ridiculous. And then his opponent, the champion out of Rufus Sport at the time, Rick Glenn, was 15-2, a legitimate record, absolutely outstanding performer. Didn't look as good as he's looked in the past, but you got an interesting storyline with Glenn, now the new champion Palmer, and Georgia Karhanian as well.
What would you like to see World Series of Fighting do differently in 2015? I think head-to-head with the UFC
makes no sense.
Don't do it. I think they need to utilize NBC a bit better because that really hasn't made any difference for them. I mean, they're running on NBC in a few weeks with a best-of program.
Yeah.
I don't know what that does. I don't know what kind of fan is tuning into fights that they've probably already seen at this point. It's a diehard audience. And they're a promotion that it's UFC and Bellator. They have their visions. World Series of Fighting, what hole are they filling?
Well, they have to find a hole. They have to find a niche. Number one, you can't have a show when the UFC or Bellator is having a show. And maybe you do what Bellator
Which
used
they
to.
also did on the night where both of them had shows.
It makes no sense. So I think what they might want to do is take a page out of Bellator's book, and that's maybe have shows on Friday night.
It might be an idea. I'd like to see them do some things differently because it feels that when one comes around, it's very rare you would get any kind of
And it's too
buzz.
bad because we got to see really high-level mixed martial arts, very exciting storylines, and I think that World Series of Fighting has enough interesting fighters that they could steal from the hardcore fans.
All right. He is John Ramdeen. I'm John Pollock. More Fight News Now Extra is coming your way.